Thank you very much, Stuart, and thank you all for coming. I'm terribly flattered to see the size of this audience. It's remarkably large. I wasn't expecting so many people, so thank you so much. I'm going to start with a little story, which I'm not going to explain, but I'm sure all of you will work out the significance of it in the course of my talk. It's a story which Caitlin Johnston, the contrarian journalist from the United States, has been circulating recently. A duck was swimming in a pond, and it floating on the surface, paddling away, and it looked down, and it saw a couple of fish swimming there. And it said to the fish, "Hi, what's it like down there in the water?" And the fish looked up and they said, "What's water?" Think about that. Okay, Russia, Putin's Russia. I'm going to sort of do a truncated version of a longer talk that I gave at the Melbourne Writers' Festival earlier this week. So if it's a little bit disjointed, forgive me, but I'm trying to give you the most important bits. We're suffering, of course, from a terrible case of Western double standards against Russia. We ignore the fact of the enormous progress that Russia's made in the 25 years since communism ended, and since Russia was shrunk to a smaller country from the Soviet Union to the Russian Federation, roughly 3/4 of the size. It's still the largest country in the world. It's still 1/8 of the world's land surface. It used to be 1/6. And it's lost a lot of population, but it's still 150 million people. It seems that some of us continue to see a need to see Russia through hostile Cold War glasses and to revert to Cold War language in thinking or writing about President Putin. We don't question, or at least some of us don't question, American-sourced, highly anti-Russian versions of events on Putin's alleged criminality or mendacity, on the alleged systemic human rights violations in Russia, on claimed Russian acts of aggression in Crimea and the Ukraine, or alleged war crimes committed by the Russian-supported Syrian government, or on Russia's claimed economic decline and relative unimportance in world affairs. We hear all this ad nauseam. The idea that Russia might just be a normal, serious and significant world power is rejected by many Western elites with scorn, and anyone who advances such views risks being excluded from serious Western policy dialogues about Russia. This recently happened to Oliver Stone. Despite his strong reputation as a brilliant American filmmaker, he was ridiculed on the popular intellectual Stephen Colbert TV show over his excellent recent documentary series, Interviews with Putin. My book, Return to Moscow, which I hope you'll buy, occasionally encounters similar negative reactions. Now, I won't talk to you about all my discussion about Trump, because we all know about Trump. We're talking about Russia tonight. But I'll come back to this point. Outside the circles that are close to Australian government, most of the folk who I rub shoulders with in Canberra, although I'm no longer close to the Australian government, I emphasise that, and people who are heavily influenced by American liberal hawk doctrine, thoughtful Australians see that Western policies of Russophobia and sanctions are not leading us to anywhere safe. They're only driving Russia, China and Iran together into a very powerful continental Eurasian strategic alliance, which is forming as we speak at a very rapid rate. It's increasingly self-reliant, it doesn't need the West, and it will be very, very strong. Russia, China and Iran. Think of it. Meanwhile, the NATO-Russian border is now just 600 kilometres from Moscow. All of those bloody gains in World War II, when Russia fought the Nazis all the way back to Berlin, have been lost in the ineptitude of Gorbachev and Yeltsin when they basically gave away Russians' safety cordon sanitaire around its western borders. Yes, a lot of countries have become free. I can see how people who are Polish or Lithuanian, Latvian, Estonian, even Ukrainian, might feel very glad that Russia's been pushed right back to its narrowest borders. But from a Russian point of view, it's a very worrying thing, because Russia has historically been very open to invasion from the West, and security in depth came from territory, and they've now lost all that territory. And they see NATO tanks parading up and down on the borders of Latvia and Lithuania and Estonia, 600 miles from Moscow, and they worry. They certainly worry. Because the fact is that Russia will not be intimidated by the West. These are a very brave and very strong people. And if they're driven into a corner by NATO, they will fight back with all their strength. And when I say all their strength, I mean nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons. Because Russia is not, having just barely escaped being destroyed by Nazi Germany, going to accept being destroyed by NATO now. They have the most intense patriotism of any people I know, and if they feel that they've been pushed back to the wall, they will defend themselves. We in the West have been improperly pressing on Russia for a long time, and yet we don't know we're doing it. This is a strange thing. We don't know how offensive and aggressive our governments are towards Russia. We somehow have turned it on its head, and we think that Russia is being aggressive towards us. It's not true. If you look at a map of American bases around Russia, there are hundreds of them. They're all around the borders. How many foreign bases does Russia have? 2, both in Syria, both the product of the current Syrian war, which I may get questions on later. All Russia's trying to do really is to protect its own security in a way that does not destroy the security of its neighbours. And I'm sorry, but I'm a Russophile. I can't pretend to be anything else. How's Putin doing domestically? Pretty well, I think. He's presiding over an efficient, autocratic, oligarchic state, a strong command economy which maintains good standards of health, education, infrastructure, living standards, and national security. Yes, there is corruption, and there are large inequalities of wealth between city and country, between rich and poor. And if you get out into the back blocks in Siberia or up in northern Russia towards the Arctic, you certainly see a much lower standard of living than you do in Moscow or St. Petersburg or the other big cities. But hey, go out to country Australia and see what it's like. If you drive between here and Adelaide, there's not a great deal between here and Adelaide. And so every industrial economy has this problem that the cities are much more vibrant and higher living standards than the countryside. Russia in the 19th century under the Tsars, when they had enormous industrial progress and put in enormous quantities of infrastructure, had a very similar system to the one Putin presides over now. It was autocratic, it was oligarchic, it was a command system. The Tsar basically said, Ivan, you run the glassworks. Volodya, you run the chemical industry. Pyotr, you run the railways. And these people became very, very rich, of course. And that's the way Russian capitalism worked. It was command state capitalism. And for a huge country like Russia, it has worked. The dynamic now is very interesting. The more Western information warfare tries to discredit and undermine Putin, the more Russians are rallying around his message of national security through unity and strength. Because Russians can see he's a well-balanced, intelligent leader. They've had lots of reminders of that lately as they've been watching Trump at work. I mean, Putin is 1,000 times more intelligent than Trump. And Putin, they trust him. They trust his patriotism, and they trust his intelligence. But the more he revitalizes Russia, the more he's hated by Western Russophobes. And so that's why we're in this very dangerous dynamic now of really a gradual sliding towards nuclear war with Russia. And it's no accident that experts in arms control feel that this is the most dangerous moment since the worst of the Cold War. If we look at Ukraine, we're seeing a very good example of how the West has tried to undermine Russia, because Ukraine was the most important part of Russia. It was as Russian as Queensland or Western Australia are Australian. Sure, it had its important regional peculiarities and particularities, but for Russians, a city like Sevastopol, the fortress of Sevastopol, is so important in their history. And the idea that Ukraine could be pulled away to join the West by massive infusions of Western money through a process of very clever regime change is something that has obviously been very distressing to Russia. And so Putin had to draw a red line, and he did. He drew a red line. He brought back Crimea into Russia, brought back Sevastopol, and he supported an insurgency of Russian-speaking, Russian cultural people in the eastern Ukrainian provinces of Lugansk and Donetsk. There's been huge bloodshed, there's been huge refugee flows, but Putin felt that he had to make a stand, and he did. My perspective so far, obviously, is very far from the majority Western perspective on my book, on Russia, I'm sorry. And my book is therefore proving to be quite controversial. I really hope you'll buy it. I really hope you'll buy copies for your friends and try and get it out there, because really our security and our children's security depends on us finding a way of living alongside Russia and China. Russia and China are going to be friends from now on, there's no doubt about that. But the question is, can we, the West, avoid getting into a nuclear war with Russia and China? We have to rediscover the mechanisms of détente, that funny old word détente, which really means no more than treating the other side with respect, talking to them regularly about common problems, recognizing that we both share a planet and we have to try to keep the planet going, and so that we can together deal with the challenge of climate change. At the moment, we're facing two huge risks: the immediate risk of being blown up in a nuclear war, which is real, and the long-term risk of climate change. And to deal with both of those, we have to learn how to deal with Russia again on a basis of mutual respect. I haven't talked much about my book. How much more time have I got? Oh, fantastic. I can use those 6 or 7 minutes very profitably. Thank you, Stuart. My book is really Return to Russia. I was a diplomat there 47 years ago, a very dutiful and loyal Cold Warrior, a very minor Cold Warrior, very much an infantry soldier. And the memories I have of that time are very vivid, and I discuss those in the first 1/3 of my book. And it really was amazing to be in Russia at the height of the Cold War. Then the second major part of the book is what I found when I went back there. And this is really a discursive series of essays about what I regard as major cultural benchmarks of Russian civilization, Russian worldview, Russian self-identity, really. So I went to places, and on the basis of those visits, I wrote chapters about things like Kiev Rus, Pozharsky and Minin, Peter the Great and his St. Petersburg Capitol building project, Pushkin and Tchaikovsky, the debate, never-ending debate between Slavophiles and Westernizers, Tolstoy, who took part in the siege of Sevastopol, the Tsarist Empire, what sort of a state it really was, because we've had our view of that state distorted by the communist presentation of it. Pasternak. The Pasternak chapter is probably the centre of my book. It's the most important chapter. You'll see when you read it. Sakharov, the very important nuclear scientist who became a dissident. The Gulag system and the Russian Jewish experience. And finally, a very close look at the reformers, Gorbachev and Yeltsin, what they represented and what they did. So quite honestly, without being vain, if you read my little book, 300 pages, you'll have a clue of the main currents of Russian identity and Russian history. So I'm quite proud of having done that, actually. It was hard work, but I'm glad I did it.
Tell us why was Pasternak so significant, that chapter?
Well, just very briefly, Pasternak bridged the pre-Soviet period, the Soviet period, and the post-Soviet period. And in his book, although it was written 30 years before the fall of communism, he looked forward to the new Russia that was being built on the ruins of communism, and he could see that it was going to be a good Russia. And what he was really asking was to the world, please leave us alone. Let us get on with being Russian. Let us express our identity. Let us express what we are. Because he was used by the CIA. Pasternak was used by the CIA. And his last 3 or 4 years of life were extremely unhappy for that reason. But read the chapter. It'll all come clear to you. And when you look at the cover of my book, it actually represents a moment, and I'll probably stop here by reading this. If I can find it quickly. It represents a lovely moment when Zhivago was dead. He'd just had his funeral, and his 2 aging friends, Gordon and Dudorov, who were typical conformist Soviet intellectuals, are sitting out in the sunset, looking out and thinking about, what future is coming. To the 2 aging friends, Gordon and Dudorov, sitting by the window, it seemed that the freedom of the spirit was there. That on that very evening, the future had become almost tangible in the streets below, that they themselves had entered that future and would from now on be part of it. They felt a peaceful joy for this holy city and for the whole land, and for the survivors among those who had played a part in this story, and for their children. And the silent music of happiness filled them and enveloped them and spread far and wide. What a noble ending that is. I'm writing from the book. Only a man who'd grown up in the gracious middle-class world of late imperial Russia and then survived the long traumatic years of war and communist autocracy, and yet still somehow kept his faith alive that Russia could look forward to a better future beyond communism, could have written such words. And then in 1997, I'm still reading from the book, 6 years into the post-communist transition under President Boris Yeltsin, Yevgeny Yevtushenko summarized Pasternak's importance thus: ideas tossed into the air of humanity prematurely, at great risk to their authors, do not vanish without trace. They turn into magnets, as it were, hovering in the air and gradually attracting more souls. So it was in the ancient Roman stone quarries in early Christian times, and later in those Soviet asylums of freedom, the cramped communal kitchens where the Russian intelligentsia used to huddle over faded, tattered typescript copies of Pasternak's banned novel Dr. Zhivago. Its clandestine readers not only inhaled the novel with the air they breathed, they also exhaled it, and its thoughts became increasingly part of the air of Russia as the country prepared itself for change. And that's what I try to represent on the cover of my book, that view of Moscow that Zhivago's 2 friends were looking out on. And if I can just leave you now, you all know what my fish story means. Can we please stop looking at Russia as if it's some sort of a monster country? Can we please recognize the water we're swimming in, the water of intense, fanatical, anti-Russian prejudice that surrounds us, and just start saying, hey, these are decent people. We're decent people. Let's be friends.